Hello, today I'll be walking through a sample calculation for staffing under OE alternate rules path 1. It would be a good idea to follow along using the OE risk-based regulatory framework for plant rating and attendance to have that document in front of you, because I will be referring to various tables throughout the document, and that way you can follow along and understand what I'm referring to. So what you see here is the front end of a database that TSSA has, where we store all the plant equipment lists, and this will help demonstrate how the calculation works. It's not publicly facing because there are some other purposes for this database, but nonetheless we can see what the contents that go into the calculation, how they all come together. So the first thing I'm going to highlight is that this is a food process plant, and that it has a path 1 score or plant rating of 4.5. And this is, if you refer to equation 2 on page 3 of the document, then you'll see that is that plant rating. And if you refer to table 1 of the same page, you'll see that implies that this should be a 4th class plant if it's under path 1. So the way that the calculation works is that you have a number of failures that can happen, and you're estimating the risk of all those failures, and you're summing those all up for each piece of equipment, and then you are and that gives you the risk, which is equation 1. To go from equation 1 to 2, you basically take the negative log, and that's how you come up with this number. So let's go into a little more detail. So if you go to table 2 in the document, and I have the document too, so I'm just scrolling around as well, following along with you, you'll see that on table 2 you have a number of top events in the leftmost column: pipe system failure, tube break, shell break, furnace failure, auxiliary system failure, and turbine failure. And so the idea here is that each of those events are going to have a risk associated with it, and we're going to sum over all of those events, and we're also going to, and for each event we're going to consider it for each piece of equipment, and we're going to get to how that works in a second. But before we do that, let's just dwell on this particular plant. We're going to look at the boilers that are there. There are 3 low water volume boilers and 1 fire tube boiler. They're all gas fired, they all produce steam, they all have about 74 gallons. The kilowatts, there's 2 that are 1500, 1 that's 3400, and 1 that's 300. And the whole plant has guarded controls. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on just one term, but what I say here pretty much applies to the whole system. So we're going to talk about furnace failure. And if you look at in table 2, if you look at furnace failure, you're applying weights for all of them, and so that's why I chose it, because it doesn't have any exceptions. It's very simple to go through. So for furnace failure, for any of these things, you start with the base frequency, and then you have all these multiplicative factors that sort of change the frequency. So the base frequency for furnace failure is given in table 5. So it is 8.97 times 10 to the negative 6. So that's there. So that's the base frequency. Now if we go back to table 2, we can see all the different weights that are applied. We have fuel type, guarded controls, design. In this interface it's called material type, but this is working fluid, occupancy, charge, and power rating. And so so each one of these terms is going to correspond to up there. And so let's start with fuel type. So we know it's gas. So if we scroll down to our modifiers, if we look at table 9, gas corresponds to a value of 10. So all of these have a modifier of 10. Guarded controls, if we look at table 8, guarded controls corresponds to 1 because there is guarded controls. Note that if there was no guarded controls, these would all be 50s, right? So equipment design, that's table 10. So we have these three, and the reason why they're in a different order is, well, I guess I could have gone like this. This probably makes more sense. So these three have the low water volume boiler. The last one is the fire tube boiler. So you get that from table 10. From occupancy, you have to scroll down to table 12. And you remember, so this is a food process plant, and we see that the occupancy, that corresponds to 0.27. So that's why we have 0.27 here. Charge, so that's the gallons of fluids. That's table 14. And so there was 74, so it's just below that 75 limit. So it's 0.1. And then the power rating, if you look at table 15, so low water volume boilers get a little bit of an extra credit here. So they're all at 0.01 because they're below 1500 kilowatts. And then we have 0.1 for that fire tube boiler. So each of these is going to correspond to a term here. And all those terms are going to be summed up, and that's shown here. And so you do the same thing for all of these things, and then you would have a value for all your boilers, you'd have a value for your compressors, and a value for your refrigeration equipment, and then you add all of that up, and that would give you your total risk, take the negative log, and you would get that rating or score. So there's, for the time being, just ignore these two terms. These are, if you look on page 3 below the equation, that there's these two additional conditions that if it has lots of if the total power is over 60K, or if there's the total pieces of equipment is more than 40, then the staffing should be first class or at least fourth class, respectively. So these are just our way of tracking that. But when you would do the calculation, I would suggest to just do the terms as described, and then you can apply these other conditions later. So you do the whole thing, and you find out that it's supposed to be unattended, but then you look and you say, well, actually I have 40 pieces of equipment, so I guess it's fourth class. So that's for boilers. We're going to talk a little bit about compressors now, or do one example from there. So let's look at what the compressors are. So we have 3 reciprocating compressors. They're all pretty much identical. They're all non-flammable, non-toxic. They all have 25 pounds of fluid. They all have a voltage of 575 volts. They all have they're all 25 horsepower, although we're converted them into kilowatts for the benefit of this discussion. So that's 18.6 kilowatts, and the plant is guarded controlled. So if we look at the compressors failures, now we're going to talk about the reciprocating compressor failure. There's a number of other terms, of course. I'm choosing this because it has the most of the weights. So if you look at table 3, you see that you have the weights for the guarded controls, occupancy, power rating, or horsepower, working fluid or material type. And this is just a term that reminds us whether it's reciprocating or not. If you had different pieces of equipment, let's say you had 2 reciprocating and 2 rotary, then you would only calculate this term for the reciprocating ones, and you'd calculate this one for the rotary one. But as a way of sort of making this easy to sort of do it automatically, we just have a term that says, is it reciprocating? So you see that for the rotary compressing, that term is 0, and that basically it nullifies that term. So the frequency, the base frequency for reciprocating compressor failure is, if you look at table 6, 1.0 times 10 to the negative 5. The guard controls stays the same, so it's 1 because there's guard controls. Occupancy is the same, so it's 0.26 because it's food processing. So the horsepower, or power rating, so you remember it was 18.6. If we look to table 16, anything below 37 is 0.01. So this is 0.01 for all of these guys. The material type was non-flammable and non-toxic. So if you look at table 17, that's 0.01. And again, this is just a dummy term to make sure it's included. So we add it for all of these, and then we sum it all up to there. So it's clear in this particular facility that the boilers are the dominant mode of equipment, and they add the most to the risk, and they drive the plant rating. So I'll do one refrigeration piece of equipment. Actually, we'll do two, and there's a reason for that. So what you'll notice, yeah, actually, we're just going to do reciprocating compressor failure because it is a screw compressor, so it's reciprocating. But we're going to, I'm going to touch on equipment design in a second, so we'll get there. But reciprocating compressors, then you have all the weights. You have guard controls, design, occupancy, charge, and refrigerant type. And so here we have these two compressors. In fact, you can see it below here. There's two compressors. They're not hermetically sealed. They have B2L refrigerants. They're indirect and built up. 300 pounds of equipment of material each, 575 voltage each, and about 150 and 75 kilowatts. Although the kilowattage doesn't matter for the refrigerator. And then again, guard controls. So if you look at table 7 and you look at reciprocating compressor failure, again, it's 1.4 times 10 to the negative 5. So that's there. The guard controls doesn't change, it's 1. So the equipment design is a bit tricky. The equipment design is a little bit different depending on which term we're talking about. So for these terms, then it'd be 1 or 2. In this case, it would be 2, based on whether it's built up or self-contained. But nonetheless, the modifier depends on the context. For these three terms, then we are looking at 0.1 or 1, and in this case, it's 0.1. It's 0.1 because it's indirect. So I also mentioned something I forgot to mention at the beginning of the video, that we did actually, an earlier version of this framework summary had it listed a little bit different, and it was a bit confusing. So we have since updated that. So if you have an older version of that framework document, it might say that it should be 0.2. But the newer version has it properly separated out. So nonetheless, the equipment design is 0.1 because it's an indirect unit. The occupancy doesn't change, so it's 0.27. So the charge, if you refer to table 19, the charge is the weight of material divided by 1,000, or 10,000. So that's 0.03 because it's 300 pounds of material. The material type, it's B2L, so it's 1. And again, just a term that just counts whether it's reciprocating or not. So again, you have these terms, you add them up, and and it counts to there, and then you add them up across there. Now, so I'm going to move on to one more plant, and the reason why I'm going to move on to that plant is because it has these accumulators here. And so I want to touch very briefly on how to deal with situations where you have sort of optional additional equipment. So actually, let me go back. So if you look at if you look at the plant we were talking about before, for a refrigeration, you had evaporator failure, condenser failure, pressure vessel failure. That only applies if you have a pressure vessel, an evaporator, or a condenser. If there are no evaporators in that plant or in the equipment list, then that term is basically zero. So you see that it's zero because there's a number of evaporators. Well, there wasn't any. Same with condensers, and same with pressure vessels. It says turbines, but that's a labeling error on our part. So what would you, and in this case, there are no turbines and there's no auxiliary systems. So what do you do if you do have that? How does that work? So that's why I wanted to show one more example. So there are types of equipment that are sort of additional to these three categories. And so accumulator is one of them. That's a piece of auxiliary equipment. And so in this case, we have these four boilers, and we have 4 accumulators. Let me go back to the equipment list. There's 4 boilers and there's 4 accumulators. So what we're going to do is, for this calculation, for each boiler, we're going to add on the risk of having those accumulators around. Whether or not, I mean, the way that the calculation works, it's sort of irrelevant how they're connected. It's just you have 4 boilers and you have 4 pieces of 4 accumulators. Well, that adds to the complexity of the situation. So if you look at table 2 for auxiliary system failure, we have a term for working fluid or material type, a term for occupancy, and a term for charge. And if you scroll down to table 5, you see auxiliary system failure. It's 5 times 10 to the negative 4. So 5 times 10 to the negative 4. The material type is the material type of the boiler. So in this case, it's the steam, and 0.27 is the occupancy. It's also a food processing plant. The charge is the charge of the boiler. So in this case, we had 2 boilers with more than 75 gallons and 2 boilers with less than 75 gallons. And then you have this term here, which is the number of accumulators. And so we really only need to know that they are there, not the characteristics about it. So it just adds to it. It's likewise with pressure vessels. We don't need to know about the pressure vessels. We just need to know that they exist. Turbines, same thing. We need to know that they exist. Evaporators, condensers. So that's how you would deal with those additional pieces of equipment. And so that brings me to the close of what I wanted to show. So if you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to TSSA and ask any questions. Otherwise, I hope this video is helpful for you, and have a good day.